The harsh glare of the alien sun beat down on Alex's weathered face as he trudged back to the cramped barracks, his muscles aching from another grueling day of forced labor. His once vibrant brown hair now hung limply, streaked with grime, a stark reminder of the harsh reality he had been forced to endure. As he neared the ramshackle shelter, a commotion caught his attention. Raucous laughter and jeers from the alien guards mingled with shrieks of pain and desperate pleas for mercy. Alex's jaw clenched, knowing he should keep his head down and stay out of trouble. The other prisoners had learned to tolerate the guards' cruelty. It was the only way to survive this nightmare. But when Alex saw her, something inside him snapped. She was Era, a young alien with sky-blue skin and long silvery hair that glowed softly in the twilight. Her golden eyes were wide with terror as a burly alien guard gripped her slender arm, his sharp claws digging into her delicate flesh. The other guards cackled and egged him on as he shoved her to the ground. Without a moment's hesitation, Alex moved, his feet carrying him in 3 long strides. His fist slammed into the alien's jaw with a sickening crunch, and the guard staggered back, more shocked than hurt. Alex stood over the cowering Era, fists raised, his wild, white hair framing his face. "Touch her again, and I'll rip your arms off," he snarled, fury radiating from him in palpable waves. The alien guard spat blue blood onto the ground, baring jagged teeth. "You'll regret that, human," he growled as the other guards closed in, brandishing electric prods. Alex braced himself for a beating, but a sharp whistle pierced the air. "Enough," barked the camp's commandant, a vicious alien known as Gres Aced. He strode forward, eyeing Alex with cruel amusement. "Throw this human filth in solitary. Let a week with no food teach him his place." Rough hands seized Alex as they dragged him away, his gaze locked with Era's golden eyes, brimming with gratitude and something deeper that made his heart stutter in his chest. Then a fist slammed into his head, and darkness took him. Steve awoke on a cold metal floor, his head pounding. He sat up slowly, taking in the cramped cell, the rusted walls, the filthy sink and toilet in the corner, and the single flickering light panel. So this was solitary. Steve almost laughed. After the crowded misery of the barracks, the isolation felt like a twisted sort of luxury. He leaned back against the wall, getting as comfortable as he could, his thoughts drifting to Era. The terror in her eyes, the soft warmth of her skin against his knuckles as he decked that guard, the memory followed him into restless sleep. Time blurred in the perpetual twilight of the cell, and Steve's stomach cramped with hunger, his head swimming with dehydration. But he endured, having survived worse in the war before that bastard Deckard betrayed them all. On what he guessed was the 6th day, the cell door screeched open. Steve tensed, ready for a fight, but it wasn't Gres or the guards. It was Era. She slipped inside, the door clanging shut behind her. She pressed a finger to her lips, her golden eyes darting nervously, and in her hands, she clutched a canteen and a hunk of bread. "I'm Era," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "I brought you food and water. It's not much, but you should have it." Steve rasped a grateful thanks as he accepted the canteen, gulping the lukewarm water. Era watched him, her brow furrowed with concern. "You're the only one who ever stood up for me, for any of us," she said softly. Steve lowered the canteen, meeting her gaze. Up close, she was even more breathtaking. High cheekbones, full lips, a regal tilt to her chin. Strength and vulnerability in equal measure. "I couldn't just stand by," he said simply. "Not again." Era's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Steve hesitated, unsure of why he felt compelled to open up to this girl. "I was a soldier," he said quietly. "Back on Earth, we were fighting the aliens, trying to stop their invasion. But we were betrayed. My whole unit was captured. I'm the only one left." Era's eyes widened, and she reached out, laying a gentle hand on his arm. Her touch seemed to burn through the filthy prison uniform. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I can't imagine what you've been through." Steve looked away. I don't need your pity. It's not pity. Era's voice was fierce. It's respect. You're a hero, Steve Ryder. Steve met her gaze again, startled. I know, hero. I couldn't even save my own men. But you saved me. Era squeezed his arm, her eyes shining with sincerity. And I won't forget it. Before Steve could respond, shouts echoed down the cell block. Era leaped to her feet. I have to go, but I'll be back. I promise. And then, to Steve's complete shock, she darted forward and pressed her lips to his in a swift, searing kiss. A heartbeat later, she was gone, slipping out the cell door and disappearing into the shadows. Steve touched his fingers to his mouth, tasting her sweetness on his cracked lips. A new determination kindled in his chest. You would get them both out of this hellhole, no matter the cost. The next evening, Era returned as promised. She slipped into Steve's cell, a fierce light in her golden eyes. I have a plan, she announced without preamble, to get out of here. Steve straightened up from where he'd been doing push-ups on the filthy floor. I'm listening. Era knelt beside him, her voice low and urgent. Every supply shipment, the commandant gets a case of alien whiskey. It's potent stuff, especially to the other guards. If we can drug it, knock them all out, we can steal a ship and make a run for it. Steve finished her thought, his mind racing. And make a break for it. Era nodded, a grim smile touching her lips. Exactly. Steve studied her, impressed despite himself. How do you know all this about the whiskey, the shipments? Era looked away, her jaw tight. Let's just say the commandant has taken a personal interest in me. He's not as discreet as he thinks. White-hot rage surged through Steve's veins at the thought of that alien filth putting his hands on Era, forcing himself on her. Era's cool fingers cupped his cheek, pulling him back. Hey, I can handle Grizz. I've been doing it for months. The important thing is getting out of here. Steve forced down his fury, covering her hand with his own. You're right. When's the next shipment due? 2 days, Era said, her thumb brushing across his stubbled jaw. I've already started stockpiling supplies, rations, water packs, a couple of charge blades. Steve's eyebrows shot up. How the hell did you manage that? Era shrugged, a sly glint in her eye. I have my ways. Just be ready to move when the time comes. I will be. Steve turned his head, pressing a kiss to her palm. I'm going to get you out of here, Era. I swear it. Era's breath caught, and they just looked at each other, the air heavy with unspoken promise. Then Era leaned in, capturing his mouth in a searing kiss. Steve groaned, tangling his fingers in her silky hair as he hauled her against him, every nerve in his body igniting at the feel of her curves pressed to his hard planes. Era straddled his lap, deepening the kiss with a needy whimper. Steve wanted to lose himself in her, forget the hell they were in for a few blissful moments. But the distant clang of a guard's boots in the corridor wrenched him back to reality. Panting, he broke the kiss, resting his forehead against Era's. We can't. Not here. Era made a frustrated noise, nipping at his bottom lip. I know, I needed you to know this isn't one-sided. That when we get out of here, I want... She trailed off, a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. I want that too, Steve rasped, smoothing a lock of silver-blue hair behind her ear. More than anything. But first, we have to survive this place. Era nodded reluctantly, climbing off his lap. She pressed one last, swift, hard kiss to his mouth. 2 days. Be ready. Then she was gone, slipping away like a shadow. Steve leaned back against the wall, already aching for her touch. But beneath the simmer of desire was something else, something bright and fierce, and unbreakable hope. The next 2 days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Steve was released from solitary, thrust back into the brutal grind of the labor camp. He kept his head down, biting his tongue against the guards' taunts and blows. Every spare moment spent planning, preparing, running through 100 scenarios in his head. He caught glimpses of Era across the yard, hauling scrap metal and machine parts. Their gazes would meet briefly, a world of meaning passing between them in a single glance. Then, on the second night, it was time. Steve lay in his bunk, every muscle coiled tight with anticipation. He stared at the rusted ceiling, listening to the snores and shuffles of the other prisoners waiting. A scream split the air, then another. Steve shot up, adrenaline spiking. That was no cry of pain or fear, that was fury. Chaos erupted, the whole camp a war zone. Prisoners grappled with guards, blue blood spraying, weapons flashing. Steve leaped from his bunk, charging out into the fray. The yard was a blur of deadly grace as Era whirled and slashed with twin charge blades, Noric guards falling before her like wheat to a scythe. Steve sprinted to her side, snatching up a fallen guard's blaster. He fired at a Noric bearing down on Era, dropping him with a bolt to the chest. Era flashed him a fierce grin, tossing him one of her blades. "Took you long enough," she shouted over the din. "Got held up in traffic," Steve quipped, decapitating a snarling guard. "What happened to drugging them?" Change of plans. Era kicked a Noric in the throat, pivoting to hamstring another. Grizz got a little too handsy. I decided to move up the timetable. Steve's vision went red. He charged forward, hacking and blasting his way to the commandant's quarters. The door was already open, hanging drunkenly from one hinge. Inside, Grizz lay on the floor in a spreading pool of cobalt blood, his throat cut from ear to ear. "I told you I could handle him," Era said from behind Steve. Steve turned to her, and in the chaos, her hair had come loose from its braid, tumbling around her shoulders in a wild nimbus. Blue blood splattered her cheeks like war paint, and her eyes blazed with golden fire. She had never looked more beautiful. Steve crossed to her in 2 strides, holding her flush against him. He claimed her mouth in a bruising kiss, pouring all his rage and relief into it. Era responded with equal ferocity, nipping at his lips, raking her nails down his back. A tremendous boom shook the building, startling them apart. Steve glanced out the window to see a plume of fire rising from the shipyard. The other prisoners had gone straight for the guards' vessels, blasting their way to freedom. "We have to go," Era panted, "before they take all the ships." Steve nodded grimly. He snatched up Grizz's pulse rifle and the commandant's key card, and together they raced through the crumbling camp, dispatching any guards foolish enough to challenge them. The shipyard was a scene of glorious pandemonium, prisoners fighting tooth and nail for a spot on the remaining ships. Era pulled Steve toward a sleek Noric fighter, dodging blaster bolts and falling debris. She slapped the key card to the access panel, and the hatch hissed open. "You sure you can fly this thing?" Steve asked, scrambling in after her. Era flashed him a wild, reckless grin as she climbed into the cockpit. "Guess we'll find out. Now get your ass in here, Ryder." Steve wedged himself into the gunner's seat, slamming the hatch closed. The interior was cramped, barely big enough for 2, but he didn't care. Era's fingers flew over the controls, and the ship shuddered to life, anti-grav thrusters whining. Era let out a whoop of triumph as they lifted off, the wrecked labor camp falling away beneath them. Steve watched it recede, hardly daring to believe it. They had done it. They were free. Era punched in coordinates, her hands shaking with relief and exhaustion. Then she turned to him, her eyes shining. "We made it," she breathed. "I can't believe we actually made it." Steve reached for her, pulling her into his lap. The cockpit was a tight fit, but he didn't care. He needed to feel her, to hold her, to convince himself this was real. "You were incredible back there," he told her fervently. "The way you fought, the way you planned all this, I've never seen anything like it." Era looped her arms around his neck, pressing her brow to his. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me the strength to fight back, to believe we could be more than slaves." Emotion clogged Steve's throat. He cradled her face in his calloused hands, thumbs stroking her high cheekbones. "Era, I." She silenced him with a kiss, deep and slow and achingly tender. Steve lost himself in the silk of her mouth, the warm weight of her in his arms. His hands roamed her back, her hips, relishing the freedom to touch her after so long denying himself. Aira reached between them, her nimble fingers working at the fastenings of his prison uniform. "I need you, Steve. Now, no more waiting." Steve surrendered to her touch, to the inferno raging through his blood. He peeled her out of her own filthy garments, bearing her to his hungry gaze inch by glorious inch. She was perfect, her blue skin flushed violet with desire. Steve bent his head to taste her, worshipping her with his lips and tongue. Aira arched against him, her fingers tangling in his hair as he loved her. They moved together, finding a rhythm as old as the stars, chasing their pleasure, determined to take back everything that had been stolen from them. Slowly, reluctantly, Aira lifted her head to look at him. Steve's eyes were soft, a small smile playing about his lips. He brushed a sweaty lock of hair from her cheek. He shook his head, at a loss for words. "Yeah," Aira agreed, her own smile blossoming. "It was." They cleaned up as best they could with a rag from the emergency kit. Then Aira settled back into his lap, too content to move. Steve wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as the stars streamed by outside the viewport. For the first time in longer than Aira could remember, she felt safe, cherished, free. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that the Norek would be hunting them, furious at the loss of their slaves and the destruction of the camp. They would need to find allies, resources, a way to strike back against the alien scourge that had subjugated so many. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They had each other, they had hope, and that was enough. Aira nestled deeper into Steve's embrace, letting her eyes drift closed. Tomorrow, they would plan and fight and claw their way to a better future. But tonight, they would rest and they would dream of freedom. Aira peered out the viewport at the dingy, decrepit hangar. Ships of every make and model were crammed into the space, a haphazard junkyard of rusting hulls and sparking circuitry. Beings of a dozen species hustled to and fro, loading and unloading cargo, haggling over prices, and casting furtive glances over their shoulders. "It's perfect," Aira declared. Steve shot her an amused look. "You might want to reserve judgment until we get inside. This place is a wretched hive of scum and villainy." "As long as none of that scum and villainy is Norek, I'll be just fine," Aira said confidently. They gathered their meager supplies and disembarked, Steve keeping a wary eye on the other denizens of the hangar. Most paid them no mind, too wrapped up in their own shady dealings, but a few gazes lingered on Aira, some covetous, others calculating. Steve's hand settled on the small of her back, a silent warning to any who might think her easy prey. Aira leaned into his touch, grateful for his steadfast presence at her side. They made their way into the bowels of the station, following the flow of the crowd. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and stale veric, the walls stained with substances Aira didn't care to identify. Steve steered them into what passed for a bar, a dingy hole in the wall with sticky floors and flickering horror screens. The patrons were a rough bunch, scarred and hard-eyed, nursing their drinks with a grim determination. Steve shouldered his way to the bar, catching the eye of the surly human tending it. "We need a room," Steve said, his voice low. "Someplace quiet, no questions asked." The bartender looked them over, taking in their ragged clothes and hollow cheeks. He named an exorbitant price, but Steve haggled him down to something almost reasonable and slid a handful of credits across the pitted bar top. Up the stairs, end of the hall, the bartender grunted. "And I better not find any bodies in the morning." "No promises," Steve said with a mirthless smile. They climbed the narrow stairs, Steve keeping himself between Aira and the lecherous stairs boring into her back. The room was small and dingy, the walls pitted with blaster scars, the lone bed sagging in the middle, but it had a locking door and an ensuite fresher, which made it a palace as far as Aira was concerned. She stripped off her filthy clothes and stepped into the fresher, hissing as the tepid water sluiced over her skin. It stunned the cuts and bruises she'd accumulated during their escape, but she relished the pain. It meant she was alive, that she'd have fought and won. Steve joined her a moment later, his big body crowding her against the cracked tile. He took the soak from her unresisting fingers and began to wash her with gentle, reverent strokes. Era leaned into him, letting him support her weight, letting him cleanse her of the last traces of the camp. When he was finished, she turned in his arms and did the same for him, mapping the new scars and old with her fingertips, learning every inch of his skin. Steve shuddered under her touch, his eyes sliding closed, his throat working as he swallowed hard. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Every caress, every shared breath was a promise, an affirmation, a vow to face whatever came next, together. Clean and dry, they tumbled into the narrow bed, limbs entwined, hearts beating in sync. Steve pulled Era close, tucking her head beneath his chin, his arms strong and safe around her. Sleek, he murmured into her hair, "I'll keep watch." Era wanted to protest, to insist on sharing the burden of vigilance, but exhaustion was already pulling her under. The events of the past few days catching up with her all at once. Secure in Steve's embrace, she let herself drift, letting the steady rise and fall of his chest lull her into dreamless slumber. She woke some indeterminate time later to Steve's tense, hushed voice. He was sitting up in bed, his back to her, the comm unit from the fighter in his hand. Getting the band back together, he was saying. Deckard may have screwed us, but there's still a few I trust. We're going to need all the help we can get if we're going to take on those Norek bastards. A pause then. Roger that. Send me the rendezvous coordinates. We'll be there. He signed off and turned to find Era watching him, her eyes clear and sharp. Who was that? She asked. An old friend, Steve said, scrubbing a hand over his face. From before. I'm calling in every favor I've got. We're going to need ships, weapons, intel, a whole-down army if we're going to have a shot at winning this war. Era's heart clenched. She knew this was coming, knew they couldn't run forever, but the thought of Steve charging back into battle, of losing him just when she'd found him. Steve cupped her face, his calloused thumb stroking her cheekbone. Hey, I know that look. I'm not going anywhere, okay? We're in this together, no matter what. Era turned her head to press a kiss to his palm. Damn right we are. And if you think I'm letting you go off and play hero without me, you've got another thing coming. Steve's mouth quirked. Wouldn't dream of it. We're a team, sweetheart, in every way. He leaned in and kissed her, slow and deep and achingly tender. Era melted into him, pouring all her love, all her fierce, defiant hope into the press of her lips to his. Tomorrow, they would fly out to meet Steve's contacts. Tomorrow, they would begin the fight anew, the desperate bid to free the galaxy from Norek tyranny. But first, they had tonight. One last stolen moment of peace in each other's arms. And Era intended to make every second count. The rendezvous point was a derelict freighter floating in the Orion cloud at the edge of the Zeta Quadrant. Steve brought their stolen fighter in slow, keeping a wary eye on the sensors for any sign of a trap. But the only contacts on the screen were a handful of small ships, each as battered and nondescript as the freighter itself. Steve recognized a few of the silhouettes: a Terran dropship, a Kra raider, a sleek Vagon courier. The kind of motley assortment he'd expect from this particular crew. He docked the fighter in the freighter's cavernous hold, the magnetic clamps locking on with a dull clang. Era was already geared up beside him, a pulse pistol on her hip and a vibro blade in her boot. She'd pulled her silver-blue hair back into a tight braid, her golden eyes fierce and determined. Steve's heart swelled with pride and affection. This woman was a warrior through and through, as tough and brave as any soldier he'd ever served with. He was damn lucky to have her by his side. He leaned over and kissed her, swift and hard, ready to meet the gang. Era's smile was sharp and bright as a blade. Let's do this. They disembarked, the airlock pressurizing around them with a hiss of atmo. Steve led the way across the pitted deck, his hand resting easy on the blaster at his hip. He trusted these people, but years of hard living had taught him to always be prepared for the worst. A hatch at the far end of the hold cycled open, and a group of figures emerged. Steve recognized them instantly: the lean, wiry form of Jax, the hulking silhouette of Big Zed, the deadly grace of Nara. And leading them, a cocky swagger in his step and a crooked grin on his face, was Finn. "You crazy son of a bitch," Finn called out, spreading his arms wide. "Aren't you supposed to be dead?" "What can I say?" Steve replied, clasping Finn's forearm in a warrior's grip as they met in the middle of the hold. "The universe just ain't ready to be rid of me yet." Finn pulled Steve into a backslapping hug, his grin widening. "Damn, it's good to see you, brother." When I heard what went down on Kif on Prime, his smile faded, his eyes going hard. "I should have been there. Should have had your back." Steve shook his head. "You were halfway across the quad, running down that lead-on Deckard. There was nothing you could have done." Finn's jaw clenched. "I'm here now, and I'm not letting that traitorous bastard get away with it. We're going to make him pay for what he did to the unit, to all of us." Era stepped up beside Steve, her shoulder brushing his. Finn's gaze cut to her, his eyebrow quirking. "And who might this lovely lady be?" "Era," Steve said, pride evident in his voice. "She's with me." Finn clutched his chest in mock affront. "You wound me, Ryder. I would never dream of putting the moves on your girl." "I'm no one's girl," Era said coolly. "I am my own woman, and I can put a blaster bolt between your eyes at 50 paces. Finn blinked, then threw his head back and laughed. "Oh, I like her. She's a keeper, Ryder." The others had gathered around by now, curious and assessing. Steve made the introductions, pride swelling in his chest as he named Era his partner in all things. His crew, his family, welcomed her with open arms and easy camaraderie. Any initial wariness quickly replaced by respect and admiration as they heard the tale of their escape. "Knew you had it in you, Ryder," Big Zed rumbled, slapping Steve on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him. "Takes more than a few scaly bastards to keep you down." Nara shook her head, her dark eyes glinting. "Wish I could have seen the look on that overseer's face when you slit his throat." "That was all Era," Steve said, pride suffusing his voice. "She's the real hero here." Era ducked her head, unused to such open praise. "I just did what needed to be done, what any of those prisoners would have done, given half a chance." "But you gave them that chance," Jax chimed in, the wiry little man's eyes gleaming. "You showed them they could fight back. That's no small thing." Emotion welled in Era's throat. These humans, these fierce, brave, loyal creatures, were unlike any beings she had ever known. They had every reason to be hard and cold, to care for nothing beyond their own survival. Yet here they were, ready and willing to risk everything for a cause greater than themselves, for the sake of others they had never met. It humbled her, even as it ignited a fire in her blood, a determination to prove herself worthy of their trust, their fellowship, to fight alongside them until every last slave was freed, and the Noric Empire was nothing but ashes and bitter memory. Finn clapped his hands, breaking the moment. "All right, people, we've got a lot of ground to cover and not a lot of time to do it in. Let's get to work." They convened in the freighter's cramped mess, hunched over a battered holotable. Star maps and intel reports flickered to life above the scarred metal, painting the room in an eerie blue glow. "Here's what we know," Finn said, zooming in on a cluster of systems near the galactic core. "In the last 6 months, the Norlax have doubled their slaving runs in this sector. Nowhere is safe." He jabbed a finger at a blinking red icon. "This is their main processing hub. Every slave they take ends up here before being shipped out to the labor camps or sold to the highest bidder." Jax agreed. "It's heavily guarded. Orbital defenses, fighter screens, capital ships, impenetrable to a frontal assault." Steve crossed his arms, his mind racing. "So we don't go in the front door. We slip in quiet, a small team. infiltrate and sabotage. Nora nodded slowly. It could work. Hit their command center, take out their sensor array, blind them long enough for our fleet to jump in and catch them with their pants down. Our fleet? Aira asked, her eyebrow raised. Finn grinned, sharp and feral. That's the other part of the plan. We've been making friends out here, gathering anyone with a grudge against the Norak. Pirates, rebels, even a few legit military types. They're scattered now, lying low. But when the time comes, they'll be ready. Steve finished, his voice ringing with conviction. An army of the damned, just waiting for the signal to strike. Aira's spine tingled with anticipation and dread. This was really happening. They were going to take the fight to the heart of the Norak Empire, the source of so much misery and suffering. And she would be right there on the front lines, standing shoulder to shoulder with these incredible, unstoppable humans. I'm in, she said, her voice firm. Whatever it takes, whatever you need me to do, I'm in. Steve reached out and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. We're all in. Until every slave is free and every Norak is spacey-doo, the Zeta Quadrant was the perfect place for their operation to take shape, hidden in the lawless expanse of dust clouds and dying stars. Steve and Aira worked tirelessly alongside Finn's motley crew, calling in every favor, every contact they could muster. Gradually, a diverse coalition of allies began to assemble: pirates and rebels, rogue military units, even a few ambitious merchant captains seeking to settle old scores with the Norak overlords. They gathered ships, weapons, intel, pooling their resources to prepare for the coming assault. Steve and Aira immersed themselves in the planning, their skills and expertise complementing each other perfectly. Aira's intimate knowledge of the Norak processing hub proved invaluable, while Steve's military experience allowed him to devise intricate strategies and contingency plans. As the final preparations fell into place, the mood aboard the derelict freighter grew increasingly tense, tinged with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They all knew the risks, the slim odds of success, but the fire of righteous fury burned bright in their eyes. The time for hiding, for running, had long since passed. On the eve of the assault, Steve and Aira stood together, gazing out at the expanse of stars. Aira leaned into Steve's side, her hand seeking his. "Are you ready for this?" she asked softly. Steve squeezed her hand, his jaw set with determination. "As ready as I'll ever be. Are you?" Aira met his gaze, her golden eyes shining with resolve. "I'm with you, Steve, all the way." They shared a tender kiss, pouring into it all the unspoken fears, the fierce hope, the unwavering love that bound them together. Then, hand in hand, they turned and strode back into the heart of the operation, prepared to lead the charge against the tyranny of the Norak Empire. The next day, the diverse fleet assembled by Finn and his crew launched their assault, converging on the Norak processing hub in a devastating blitz. Steve, Aira, and a small team of elite fighters infiltrated the heavily guarded facility, battling their way through wave after wave of startled guards. Aira's charge blades whirled in a deadly dance as she carved a path through the chaos, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. Steve fought at her side, his pulsed rifle spitting bolts with unerring precision, taking down any Norak foolish enough to stand in their way. Together, they fought their way to the command center, Aira slicing through the security protocols while Steve provided cover fire. With a triumphant cry, she initiated the overload sequence, triggering a cascade of system failures that rippled through the entire facility. As alarms blared and chaos erupted around them, Steve and Aira made their escape, sprinting through the collapsing corridors to rendezvous with the rest of the team. Outside, the skies were ablaze with the fury of the battle, the ragtag fleet of rebels and outcasts engaging the Norak's formidable defenses in a desperate, high-stakes clash. Steve and Aira leaped aboard their fighter, Aira's fingers flying over the controls as she guided the ship into the fray. They weaved and rolled, laying down withering fire to support their allies, while Steve manned the gunner's seat, his aim true and deadly. In the midst of the battle, A massive Norek dreadnought emerged from hyperspace, disgorging waves of reinforcements. The tide seemed to be turning against the rebel forces, their hard-won gains threatened by the sheer might of the enemy. But just as all seemed lost, a series of massive explosions rocked the Norek command hub, sending the entire facility spiraling into oblivion. The rebel fleet, seizing the opportunity, surged forward, targeting the stunned and disoriented Norek ships with renewed vigor. Steve and Era watched in awe as the tide of the battle shifted, the Norek forces crumbling under the relentless onslaught. Era let out a whoop of triumph, punching the air, while Steve grinned, his heart swelling with pride and exhilaration. When the smoke cleared and the last Norek vessel had been destroyed or fled, the rebel fleet gathered, their battle-scarred ships gleaming in the starlight. Steve and Era disembarked, greeted by a raucous cheer from the assembled crew. Finn strode forward, his face split in a wide grin, and clasped Steve's hand. "Down, Ryder, I knew you had it in you. That was one hell of a show." Steve laughed, pulling his old friend into a fierce embrace. "We couldn't have done it without you, Finn. All of you." Era stood at Steve's side, her hand slipping into his, and smiled up at him, her golden eyes shining with a mixture of relief and pride. "We did it," she breathed. "We actually did it." Steve cupped her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "We did, and it's just the beginning." He pulled her close, capturing her lips in a passionate kiss, pouring into it all the love, the hope, the promise of a future free from the shackles of Norek tyranny. Around them, the rebel crew cheered and whooped, celebrating their hard-won victory. But for Steve and Era, in that moment, the galaxy seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, united in their determination to forge a new path, to build a better tomorrow for all those who had suffered under the oppressive rule of the Norek. As they broke apart, breathless and flushed, Era rested her forehead against Steve's, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "So, what's next, Ryder?" Steve grinned, his eyes alight with purpose. "Whatever we want. The galaxy is ours for the taking." Hand in hand, they turned and strode into the future, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, confident in the knowledge that as long as they had each other, they could overcome any obstacle and forge a destiny of their own making.